From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Turkey. We'll be discussing the upcoming local elections at the end of March, the economic slowdown, Turkey's foreign policy challenges, particularly in Syria, and its relationship with the U.S. On the program today are Gonul, the director of MEI's Turkey program, and Bob Pearson, a non-resident scholar at MEI, former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, and former director general of the U.S. Foreign Service. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Gonul, let's start with you. What are the biggest issues on the radar for Turkey this year?
March elections, the local elections, I think it's critical. The Turkish voters will be electing thousands of mayors and district councils. I think the competition will be particularly critical in big cities such as Ankara and Istanbul. The elections, they will not change the general balance of power in the country, but it's still quite important to what President Erdogan wants to do in the country. It's important to his vision because these are the cities that have played an important role in the country's economic boom. And in the country's constitutional referendum in 2017, President Erdogan lost ground in those cities. So it's both symbolic. I think it's symbolic because Istanbul is an important city for President Erdogan. That's where his political career started. And also, I think losing ground within urban young middle-class voters will point to Erdogan that this could be the beginning of the end. So it has a psychological
sort of a bellwether effect.
Exactly, dimension. And also, over the years, President Erdogan built a clientelistic network. And I think that was one of the reasons for his electoral success. And I think losing those big cities will deal a huge blow to that network. So that's why I think March elections are very critical. And also, and Bob can say more about this, the state of Turkish economy is very important. And also the foreign policy issues such as Turkey's relations with Russia, with the United States and the European Union as Turkey's largest trading bloc. So I think these are the important things to watch in 2019.
Bob, on the economy front, the last 6 months or so has been a particularly difficult period for the Turkish economy with the currency crisis.
Right.
Is there likely to be any light at the end of the tunnel this year, or will it be kind of more of the same?
No, I think the Turkish economy is in difficult shape, and I think the pressures on Turkey are mounting. The inflation rate is going up. Housing prices are going down. People are beginning to worry in the old way about the erosion of wealth in the country. And we saw in 2015, as Gonul pointed out before, and we saw again last fall, and a clear erosion of public support for Erdogan as a result of economic problems. And this is the one thing he can't really control. And so he does try to divert attention into foreign affairs as much as possible and to blame the Kurds for problems and others for problems in order to maintain his base of support. But in some way, it's not possible to keep always preventing further erosion. So I think the March elections are going to be a bellwether for that as well, not just a vote for how the young and the urban feel about Erdogan, but a vote for among middle-class people about how they feel the country is going and the economy is going. This has always been his trump card, the economy. And so now I think it's a special testing time for him, and he doesn't have the power to control this issue the way he does other issues.
Shifting gears to foreign policy, I wanted to ask you about U.S.-Turkey ties, and in particular the issue of Syria and the U.S. troop withdrawal. President Trump's announcement about 3 weeks ago now caught everyone by surprise. But since then, he and his advisors have backpedaled. U.S. policy seems to be changing by the day. Where do things stand, and what's the latest on that?
What's most interesting is that after President Trump's announcement on December 19, 20 really produced chaos in the Middle East, in Turkey, in the United States, and the Republican Party, and then became the famous walk back, which resulted in a trip to Jerusalem and to Ankara this week. And now the walk back has received a rejection. So we are in the process of seeing if Mr. Erdogan can go back to Mr. Trump and convince him again to stay with the promise he gave on the early December conversation to pull troops out of Syria in a way, this is the most important part for me, in a way that doesn't really offer concrete protections for the Kurds and which pretends that the Turks will be able to manage the ISIS issue. And so I think two vulnerabilities there that the Turks can't cover. The U.S. Congress will now get involved. And so the situation is actually much more complicated than if Mr. Trump had said nothing on December 19 and 20. And so I think we can safely say that this will be a tendentious relationship going forward this year because now there are so many more things in play that haven't been in play before.
It seems like there's a huge discrepancy within Trump's own foreign policy team on exactly what the policy towards Syria should be, and in particular between National Security Advisor John Bolton, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and then Trump himself. And what's your kind of read on that situation? Is it a case of Bolton freelancing? Are we looking at, as Al Monitor put it, the emergence of rival fiefdoms? What's your take?
Well, we actually have a roadmap now. We know that Trump's first economic advisor spent hours and hours trying to convince him that trade imbalances weren't all that bad. And finally, he gave up and left. We have Secretary Mattis, who spent days and hours convincing Mr. Trump that the way the U.S. led in the world and the way we distributed our assets diplomatically and militarily favored American interest. And he was rebuffed and he left. So the truest thing about Mr. Trump is that he doesn't forget his predictions and his promises. So in some form, this will come back. The walk back will be walked back, and there will be a new statement which will try to encourage the Turks. And I have an idea that maybe Mr. Trump thinks somehow that he can build a good relationship with Mr. Erdogan, and on the basis of that, sell him Patriot missile system, for example, which was approved the day of the conversation. And there are delegations going back and forth on the question of Fethullah Gulen, which is a very new opening in the relationship. And there is the congressional concern about the delivery of F-35 fighters and so on. So Mr. Trump, in the way he thinks, may have in mind a big deal.
Sort of grand bargain involving
a
all
grand
of this.
bargain in which he will put everything he can on the table to see if he can break through what he sees as an impasse in the relationship. I don't assign a high percentage to that, but he did it with North Korea. It's the way he likes to operate, and so I wouldn't rule it out.
But if I may quickly, I think that grand bargain is just not quite possible with Turkey. There are just so many problems. And some of those problems, firstly, I have to say that some of the problems have become structural. And if you look at the contextual problems, they are really difficult to solve, even for President Trump, who is so willing to build bridges with President Erdogan. And the Syria issue is going to remain there because John Bolton, he talked to journalists in Israel, and he said that the withdrawal would be based on conditions such as the protection of the Kurds in Syria or the defeat of Islamic State. And he also said that U.S. Wants to be assured of Israel's security.
Which seems to have spoiled his visit to Ankara.
Exactly, before pullout. And that means that they still want to curb Iran's power. So that means that the withdrawal can take months, if not years. And that's what has angered Ankara, because they were expecting a quick withdrawal. And second, they weren't thinking about the US is in a way indicating that they still want to be partners. They still want to have some kind of relationship with the Syrian Kurds. And that's quite problematic for Turkey. But what's troubling, I think, also from the US perspective, is that this entire strategy, outsourcing the fight against ISIS to Turkey, or curbing the task of curbing Iran's influence in Syria to Turkey, these are very problematic things for the US strategy in Syria. Because first, Turkey, there are so many problems, and Turkey is not a reliable ally. It cannot deliver on these tasks. I mean, Bob just mentioned fighting ISIS. It's a huge task. And what Turkey envisioned, I think, initially was a buffer zone right along the southern border. Between the Tigris and Euphrates River. But I think Turkey never actually thought about going deeper into the south. And I think Turkish military is not capable of that. And there is, in fact, divisions within Turkish military. Just a few days ago, 2 4-star generals were fired who played important roles in Syria, in Afrin operation, just because they were against this Syria strategy, a new military incursion into northeastern Syria, and undertaking the task of fighting ISIS. And their argument has been, we are not capable. We cannot do that. We cannot fight ISIS in places like Deir ez-Zor, which is further south. So there is a division within the military, and they were assigned to desk jobs. So I think there are a lot of problems here. And in terms of curbing Iranian influence, at the moment, Turkey has no interest in that. And if you look at the region in general, I think Turkey is not in a place to play that role. Iran, I think Iran has a lot more tools to spread and enhance its influence. It has soft power. It's not just the Shia militias that Iran is using to enhance its power. It has other tools at its disposal, and Turkey simply does not have those tools to counter Iran's influence. So I think this whole strategy of let Turkey do it will not work in the long term. And we will see if, in fact, Americans really have all these goals that were outlined by Bolton. It will be very problematic for Turkey to work with the U.S. on other issues as well.
Gonul, Erdogan has repeatedly threatened to carry out this military operation against the YPG east of the Euphrates. And indeed, those threats are, in part at least, some of what seems to have prompted Trump's sudden decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. And again, he's repeated them in light of Bolton's visit to Ankara. Is that still likely to happen, or do you think Erdogan will adopt more of a kind of wait-and-see attitude to kind of see how the U.S. position evolves?
I think this latest decision, what happened to these 4-star generals, just points to the fact that Erdogan is willing to move forward. And also, given we just talked about the state of economy, domestically, Erdogan really does not have much to offer. He doesn't have a positive message. And that's why an operation like this could help him domestically. So I would say it's possible. But of course, it would be very risky. Given the U.S. presence there, and both President Trump and the people around him, including American military officials, told the Turks that this is something that would really affect the relationship, and this is something that they did not want. So it's possible, but it would be a very risky operation, I think.
Bob, what's your read on this? Do you see this as kind of a real threat, or a sort of part of the campaign ahead of the March elections, a sort of appeal to nationalist voters?
I think it's an appeal. I think basically Mr. Erdogan is trying to pretend again that he's going to do something really big, but basically he just needs the U.S. as the target for this pretense that he's going to do something really big. But I do think that there is another clear option here. Mr. Erdogan will try to get Trump to return to the original December 1920 promise, okay? And if he does, then he will work from there. because he will have an enhanced position with Syria. He will be able to, in the end, what he really wants is a kind of hegemony over the Turkish border from the Mediterranean to Iran to manage the security of that area. And it is possible, although I agree with Gonul, it is not likely, but it is possible that he could enter into some sort of grand deal with Trump whereby the new theory would be that they're all protecting a NATO country and its borders, and there will be some sort of power over that area. In order to do that, they're going to have to get the Russians to agree. So the Turks are doing everything possible to stay as close to the Russians as possible so that they would get this favor at the end, which is possible but not predictable. The other thing that Mr. Erdogan could do is to double down on his relationship with Russia. And learn to live with Damascus and accept the relationship with Iran. He wants greater influence and power in the Middle East. He has the right position from his perspective with respect to Israel. He has Hamas to protect. He has the Palestinians as his favorite cause for concern about Israel's behavior. He's taken Saudi Arabia down a couple of notches. He can ignore Egypt. He's intimidated Iraq. He now has 3 bases in the Middle East, in Somalia, in Sudan, and in Qatar. And he has a good defense industry, which is working on drones and fighter aircraft and naval vessels. And so his longer-term goal while he remains in power is to steadily expand his power. And I think that he has in his hands now the option of whether to take the American promise and see how much he can get out of it, or double down on his current bet with the Russians and the Iranians and see how much that will get him. And 2019 may give us that answer, or it may not. But I think in his mind, that's what he is thinking about.
But of course, I think Bob mentioned the role of Russia. It's really critical here.
I was just about to ask about that.
yeah, because I don't think Russia would like the idea of a Turkish military incursion into northeastern Syria, and they've mentioned over and over again that the regime could take over those areas, and the regime is more than happy to do it. I think that would be the ideal scenario for the Russians. Given, especially if the Americans decide to withdraw. So I think that's why I'm arguing that Turkey is now weaker vis-a-vis Russia, especially if the Trump administration makes clear that Americans will be withdrawing soon.
You wrote a particularly prescient piece last month before Trump's announcement, actually, on the potential problems that a U.S. withdrawal from Syria could create for Turkey. Could you elaborate on some of that? I thought it was really fascinating.
Yes, I mean that was the gist of my argument, how a U.S. withdrawal would weaken Turkey's hand in Syria. Again, if you look at Turkey's operations in Afrin, for instance, the reason that decision, Turkey had been wanting to intervene in Afrin for a long time, for over a year, and yet it couldn't secure the green light from Russia. And that green light only came after the U.S. announcement that they were building a border force with the Syrian Kurds. So I think that was a critical moment, and that showed us that the Russians were particularly concerned about the partnership between the Americans and the Syrian Kurds, and they were worried that Americans were in Syria for the long term. So that prompted their decision to allow the Turks to move forward with the Afrin operation. And before that, again, Russia's decision, Russia's green light was critical to Turkey's first military operation in 2016. So I think that has been Russian strategy to drive a wedge between Turkey and the United States and weaken the Kurds, to push Kurds, to force Kurds to give some kind of concessions to the regime. And to a certain extent, it worked. But if Americans are not there anymore, I think Russians will not really want Turks to launch another military incursion. But here I have to mention Idlib. Idlib is still important for Russians. There's an agreement cut between Russia and Turkey last year, and Turkey is supposed to deliver. Well, there's a buffer zone there, and Turkey is working with the radical Al-Qaeda linked groups there. So Russia still needs Turkey there, and obviously Russia needs Turkey for the Astana process, because it has, in a way, through Turkey's participation, it has become more legitimate. So for those reasons, Russia needs Turkey. But if there's a problem in Idlib, for instance, if Turkey doesn't deliver on its promises in Idlib, it's going to be, Turkey-Russia partnership is going to be very difficult. And in that case, you can certainly forget about a Turkish military incursion into northeastern Syria.
Can I just add one small comment? I completely agree with Gonul's approach. I'm not talking about a Turkish military incursion as such and a permanent, but I think Turkey will always have as a priority that southern border and its security. And it doesn't trust Syria, and it won't trust Syria, and the Russians won't stay there forever. So in some way, what I'm anticipating is some acceptance of a Turkish presence on that border sufficient for raids, sufficient for some form of settlement and stability operations that are very short term, but operate a little bit like they've been operating in Iraq. So I think that is conceivable, and I think that in a way that's about all that Turkey wants, plus the return of refugees. So if that's the end game for Turkey with Russia, I think they would be satisfied with it.
One last point, Bob, that I wanted to ask you about was the issue of missile defense that you kind of touched on briefly earlier. The U.S. approved the sale of the Patriot missile system, but Turkey is pushing for Russia's S-400, which isn't interoperable with NATO. How do you see this playing out?
Well, it's very interesting because getting out into the details, the Russians are hardly likely to have given all of the coding for the S-400 system to the Turks, since the Syrians have it and other people have it. And in fact, it's the same system arrayed in Kaliningrad against Poland. So the Russians have held something back. And the Russian techs may insist that they are the ones that control the missiles as well, as they did in Ukraine and as they do in other places. So I think it is possible for the United States, if it were flexible enough on the software associated with a Patriot system, to find some ground in which the Turks might find the offer attractive. Now, the Turks are marvelous at negotiating arms deals, and so it would take some time and it would be complicated, but it is a decent offer. And if it attracts Turkish interest, it provides an opening. If the Turks turn it down cold, then I think they've made a big mistake, because if they turn it down cold, the delivery of the F-35 fighters follows in time, and it would provide a perfect excuse for the Congress to withdraw authorization for the delivery of those fighters.
But of course, one problem with that Patriot missile decision is that Turkey has always wanted technology share, and that's something that's missing in the offer, I think. And another problem is, of course, one condition of the Congress is that Turkey gives up the S-400 missile system. So that, again, going back to the Syria dynamics, that's going to be very difficult, because now I think Turkey will be weaker vis-a-vis Russia. So withdrawing from the S-400 deal is not an attractive option for Turkey at a time when Turkey will need Russia even more in Syria. So I think, and also Turkish policymakers repeatedly said that they will be purchasing the S-400, that they would be delivered in the summer of 2019. So there is no indication that Ankara will give up the purchase of S-400. And when that is the case, I think the decision, the State Department's decision, and I think they got the green light from the Congress to sell Patriots, is going to be meaningless.
So as ever, these questions are complicated and interlinked.
Can I just add one small comment? As a diplomat, I'm always looking for some way a deal could be accomplished. I think the Patriot software could be provided in part to the Turks. I think the Turks could find any number of ways to delay the installation of the operational initiation of the S-400 system. They don't have to void the deal. And so all I guess I'm saying is that from a diplomatic standpoint, the offer of the Patriot system, which is a first and a clear American offer, is an opening for a discussion that could lead to better relations and could lead to an adjustment of the relationship between Turkey and the U.S. and Turkey and Russia.
Something to watch in 2019.
Thank you.
We're going to have to leave it all there. Thank you both for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for listening in as well, and to our colleague Scott for producing today's program. We'll see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.